Ancient History Refined. Scientific tools lead to new discoveries and synchronizing of historical chronologies. Authored by Jeff Walling. This is chapter 3 of my series on my book, Ancient History Refined. Okay, let's get started on chapter 3. The title of chapter 3 is King David to the Flood, Timeline in Sync. Here we have a diagram showing Egypt versus Israel's timeline. And of course, this is based on the Walling Biblical Timeline, which is taken from Acts 13:18 through 22. Those are Paul's specific time segments that he's given for certain benchmark events. And it's also utilizing the adjusted Egyptian timeline based on the scientific analysis that we did in Appendix A and B of Ancient History Refined. Okay, so these dates are going to be the main date here is the Walling Biblical Timeline. This is the true timeline as we have concluded in our introductory to the book, Ancient History Refined. And and then here is a comparison of the difference in time. So this would be the Walling Biblical Timeline. Here we have it in 50-year segments of 1500, 1550, 1600, all the way to 1800, and then the corresponding secular timeline dates based on our analysis, our scientific analysis, following the scientific analysis. And it's like, for instance, 1800 corresponding date in the secular dating system is 1922, all the way down here to 1500, and the secular date being 1581. And the key date here, the Exodus, around 1552, 1550. The corresponding date is 1661. So when they did the carbon-14 and dating of the end of the occupation of Avaris, which Manfred Tech puts at 1550 BC, they came up with actually exactly a 1661 BC date. And when we look at the end of A's, or actually the end of the 13th dynasty, corresponding with the end of A's, the Pharaoh A's reign, was also around 1552, and it had the exact same corresponding date, 1661, in the secular dates. So right off the bat, we find a really an alignment here, proving the or actually just another bit of evidence showing that the accuracy, once we go through this diagram, the accuracy of the offset of these dates. Okay, and so let's get started here at the top here. This timeline here is the timeline of Avaris. This was dated by Manfred Tech, and he has it for from 1783 to 1550, 233 years, using archaeological dating methodologies, your uh, archaeological dating methodologies. And then you have this would be the first occupation of Avaris. Okay, there was a second occupation by the Hyksos. All right, in the 16th dynasty after 1550 BC, following 1550. All right, so this would have been a period where the Hebrews lived in Avaris when they first came into Egypt. When Joseph was first made the second ruler of the kingdom under Sennacherib II, okay, which was 1776. About what 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 years difference from uh, uh, Manfred B-Tech's first initial occupation date. Not bad, good margin of error there. And the actual end of their occupation of Israel in Egypt was around 1552, according to the Walling Biblical Timeline, which exactly corresponds with the end date of Avaris. Okay, without no adjustments, regardless of carbon 14, just using both the biblical timeline, that is from based on Acts 13:18 through 22 from Paul, and Manfred B. Text dating using um, archaeological dating methodologies. Okay, so we got that's one of our core dates that we use to determine the difference between the actual Wallen biblical timeline and other historical references such as the dating of Avaris and also Josephus's timeline, which exactly matches the Wallen biblical timeline. So we have a validated timeline, and we determined the difference between this point and this point in the carbon-14 dating. This was off by about 100 years. Well, you can see here this is off by about a little over 100 years. And then this other date here, which was about 120 years difference. See? And then we drew a best fit curve between those two dates and extended it out and up um, to the flood and back to the time of Christ. And then we adjusted our dates of the Egyptian pharaohs and the dynasties according to these offset dates and any interpolation in between, and came up with a shifted and then we when we took these dates that I had made charts for based on 50-year increments, applied them to this timeline, adjusted it accordingly, uh, just like these differences here. So anything that happened in 1661 would have been adjusted to 1550. Anything that happened in 1863 BC, we would adjust it to 1750, and in between exactly the same. So that's where these dates come from. Okay, for the um, Egyptian dynasties. So, and we're going to see here in this diagram how perfect synchronization, perfect alignment, and then out of that, the proof of concept being all of the patterns of evidence found in each of these dynasties and their timing and everything compared to Israel's time in Egypt according to the Wallen Biblical Timeline. All right, so as we said, here's the first thing we looked at was the occupation of Avaris. This is also known as Goshen in the Bible, starting at 1783, actually starting at 1776, where Joseph was made the number 2 ruler in Egypt until his death in 1697, and then where after which Israel went into bondage in Egypt for 145 years. Okay, until the Exodus in 1552, which perfectly matches the occupation of Avaris. Okay, so that timeline is already there's a synchronization that is just based on exact datings of each of these times here. Perfect match. Then we get into the Egyptian dynasties and certain pharaohs that we are going to look at here and see the perfect timing here. So Joseph going in 1776, he went in when Sesoseret II was the pharaoh. He died in 1697, and the Bible tells us that a pharaoh arose that did not know Joseph and put the Israelites into bondage. Well, at that exact same time period, the 12th dynasty ended and the 13th dynasty arose in Egypt. So that is uh, interesting, right? The perfect timing, exactly timed with the Bible for that interface between the 12th and 13th and the time of Joseph's death and Israel's put in bondage. Okay, and coincidentally, the 14th dynasty also rose at about the same time. Now, the 14th dynasty was really not an Egyptian dynasty. I don't know why they even call it a 14th dynasty of Egypt, because it was not a dynasty. These were actually rulers of a vassal province there in Avaris, okay, over the Hebrew taskmasters. Okay, again, exactly 145 years, ending in 1550, 1552, just perfectly aligned with the Exodus. Okay, they were not pharaohs, but Semitic rulers. They did not have their names in a cartouche. They did not have names in a cartouche. So that's very significant to the fact that they were not pharaohs. Okay, so isn't that interesting? You had the 13th dynasty arise right at about the time of Joseph's death, a dynasty that did not know Joseph and all the great things he did under the 12th dynasty, under Sennacherib the second and the third. And then you had the 14th dynasty, which was appointed by the 13th dynasty to rule over the taskmasters to bring Egypt into bondage. Look at the coinciding timeline, perfect timeline. Okay, with this now this adjustment to these pharaohs was totally separate. We didn't look at patterns of evidence and let's say, hey, let's adjust this. No, we adjusted it according to the differences between three benchmark dates where they carbon 14 dating, the offset between the carbon 14 dating and the biblical timeline, and then we applied that to the dynasties to readjust their dates, and lo and behold, we got a perfect match. Okay, just totally independent of any uh, patterns of evidence which surfaced after we did this, which some of which was captured by David Roll and Timothy Mahoney in the patterns of evidence. So they got some of it right, but they also got a lot of it wrong, especially the timeline they used was wrong. They used the timeline from 1 Kings 6:1, uh, which would have put the Exodus in about 1450 BC, and that's 100 years difference, and that's why they're not getting anything out of it. That's why David Roll had to do a bunch of arbitrary shifting, trying to match things up to his timeline, because his timeline just did not have a synchronous benchmark dates along those timelines with the secular chronology. He had to end up rearranging his. I did not have to do that. I just scientifically approached this, given the creation science that is out there, and because everybody else is using the First Kings timeline, they're not getting the synchronization that they're looking for. I happen to check out all three of them. The Acts one is a perfect uh, timeline with historical dates that you don't get out of the First Kings one, so that validated that timeline. Going from there, we took that secular, that creationist science. We adjusted the dates accordingly, and then compared them to the dates and benchmark things that happened, like Moses and A's reign here, and Sennacherib's second and thirds, the events that happened in their reigns, and found a perfect match. Wow, God is good. I tell you, this was really an awesome thing that the feeling that I got out of this when I was finally discovering all this, I was just getting goosebumps every time I turned around. And it's to this day. Last week I discovered some new synchronizations and proof of concepts. And that's the thing. All these synchronizations are coming along with proof of concepts, which no other timeline has. So you got to take this serious. This is not no fly by night. I think it's this based on this arbitrary point of view. This is very much down the center of science in creation science, and it is proven to be a real tool for advancing both science and history. So because they play off of each other. So here we go, Joseph. So we know that Israel came into Egypt in 1767. Um, 10 years after Joseph was made second ruler in Egypt, and they were in Egypt for 215 years. Okay, until the Exodus in 1552, and just exactly as the uh, Bible says when God was talking to Abraham, saying that his offspring will be in Israel and they will be in bondage for 4 generations. And when you look at this timeline here, you see that Joseph came into Egypt in 1776. He ruled all of Egypt and Canaan at this time. Matter of fact, this was the period uh, where where all of uh, the outlands outside of the area of Iris, the Fayum district where the Pharaoh lived, became very poor because of the drought. Came to Joseph. Joseph took their, they gave Joseph their money, gave Joseph their riches, gave Joseph their stocks, their livestock, their lands, and themselves. Okay, and that's perfectly reflected in Sennacherib II's reign. We'll talk about that in a minute. But then he dies in 1697, and then the Bible says a dynasty or a pharaoh arose that did not know Joseph and put them into bondage. And that was in 1697, 145 years. You divide that by the 4 generations that God said they would be in bondage, and you come up with about 36.3 years per generation, which fits the generational constant perfectly. So there's your 4 generations. And then we know that at that same time that Joseph died, the 13th dynasty arose. A pharaoh that did not know Joseph, did not know all the good that he did, and he reigned up until this exactly this time of the Exodus, was when his administration when the 13th dynasty came to an end under the Pharaoh A. Okay, he was Pharaoh for the last 23 years of the 13th dynasty, which came to a very devastating end. Okay, and at the same time, we said that the 14th dynasty was appointed by the 13th dynasty to rule over the Hebrew taskmasters. Okay, so look at this alignment. Look at this synchronization and alignment. It's just perfect. So let's look at the Pharaoh of the 12th dynasty when Joseph was made number 2 ruler. That aligns with Sennacherib II, who reigned for 15 years from 1781 to 1766. Okay, this pharaoh is famous for building canals throughout the delta, right where Avarice is, and matter of fact, where he lived in the Fayum district is right there at the delta, where the Nile River comes into the Mediterranean. At that point, it fans out and it's considered a delta. Okay, so we know that the first thing Joseph would have done appointed as the number 2 ruler, his first job, of course, the Pharaoh made him the treasurer. He had the he was appointed the task of being able to raise crops and store crops for 7 years until the uh, drought came in. So that's the first thing you would do is build canals for irrigation. As a matter of fact, that's what they were for. They weren't for navigation or any other purpose. The Egyptologists, such as Harong and a couple others, definitely say that these canals were for irrigation for growing corn. Oh man, here we go. Proof of concept. So this alignment aligns with a particular pharaoh who was known for making canals for irrigation for growing crops. Okay, perfect point, benchmark time that aligns perfectly, is synchronized perfectly. And then, of course, 7 years later, after 1776, the dearth started. The They started getting their droughts, and then 3 years into the drought, Israel comes in to Egypt in 1767. All right, driven there, but because of the drought. And then 1766, a year later, Sennacherib II dies. Sennacherib III becomes the pharaoh, and then he reigns for 37 years from 1766 to 1729. And this pharaoh is famous for, in his time, becoming very wealthy. That area, the Fayum district, becoming very wealthy. The area around the uh, the Pharaoh, which is also where Joseph lived in Avaris. All right, had become very, very wealthy and very prominent, uh, um, and while all the provinces outside of that area became very, very poor and less important. Okay, and includes Egypt and Canaan, just like the Bible says. So it's pretty amazing. So now we've got a synchronization that has showed proof of concept both in the the time that Joseph became number two ruler and his task to grow crops, preparing for the dearth, and then during Sennacherib III's period where he became very wealthy, just as the Bible says. Okay, so um, we go on and we go on from there. The rest of the 12th dynasty, Joseph is ruling the world, the known world at the time, all of Mesopotamia, all of Canaan, all of Egypt. Joseph is ruling over them. All of the provinces throughout Canaan, throughout Egypt, Joseph appointed mayors over them. This is reflected in the Amarna letters, which talk about the provinces of Egypt, uh, and so on. So, and then comes along 1697 when Joseph dies and Israel's put into bondage. Okay, and so we showed where that at that exact same time, both the 13th dynasty and the 14th dynasty arose. Okay, which perfectly coincides with the biblical narrative. All right, and so as we go through the 13th dynasty, we see this king Sobek-Hotep the third arises, and he's only a pharaoh for like 4 or 5 years, but they're not exactly sure of the time. It was within this 20-year period. Well, guess what? It perfectly aligns with Moses. Okay, perfectly aligns with the time of Moses, and this pharaoh, he is known, okay, for I believe for being the author of what is called the Brooklyn Papyrus. Okay, the Brooklyn Papyrus is a list of names on contains a list of slaves that were to be sold at an in-state in Thebes. One of the names listed was Shiphrah. Okay, Shiphrah may have been the midwife instructed to kill the Hebrew newborn males, okay, as she was personally known to the Pharaoh. Look at Exodus 1:15 on that. So what another coincidence. This alignment shows this Pharaoh as both having made a list of slaves that had Hebrew names, so we know that it was during the time the Hebrews occupied this area. And one of them was specifically a name that was on that list that was personally known to the Pharaoh, and also told of in the Bible. He was Moses. She was Moses's midwife. Okay, so isn't that a coincidence? So here we got coincidence here with these two pharaohs, and now this absolutely perfect alignment here with Moses being born in 1632. Of course, he was 80 years old when during the Exodus. And now you have Pharaoh A, all right, the last pharaoh of the 13th dynasty, okay, and his time is known for trouble. in Egypt because he doesn't have a whole lot of accolades to his name, and his administration in 1661 secular date corresponded with 1550 BC in the well, in biblical timeline. The brings an end to the 13th dynasty with a complete collapse of his administration. Okay, which perfectly aligns again with the Bible. Both the fact that he died at that time, the 13th dynasty came to an end at that time, and perfectly aligns with the end of Avaris, and also the Exodus, and and he is the last pharaoh of the 13th dynasty. So everything about his reign perfectly aligns with the time. This is the pharaoh of the Exodus. Okay, he reigned for 23 years. The Bible tells us that Moses, uh, after a period of time, all the previous um, pharaohs that knew him died. So that was a good 80, 90, 40, 50, 60 years maybe into that. So that makes perfect sense. It aligns just with the narrative of the Bible. And then he comes back here at 15. Well, that was definitely 80 years. So 80 years after the trouble he had in the first 40 years in Egypt, he ran off into the desert there with the Midianites, with Midian, and then he comes back in 1552 as an 80-year-old man. And as the Bible says, that at that time, all the pharaohs that knew him had died by that time, leaving who did not know him. Okay, so this again, the narrative of the Bible, the historical facts and benchmarks are again perfectly aligned. Okay, so here we go. And then this is also exactly the same time that the Exodus happened, that both the 13th and 14th dynasty came to a devastating end, just completely collapsed. Okay, and of course these guys, these rulers over the taskmasters, were in Avaris at the time, and Avaris ended here, the time of Egypt, according to the only biblical timeline, and the adjusted dates for the uh, 13th dynasty perfectly aligned, and along with the 14th dynasty. Right after this collapse, the 15th dynasty arises, and in conjunction with that, the 16th dynasty, which were the Hyksos, that also occupied Avaris. That was the second occupation of Avaris, which the Hyksos is believed to be the Amalekites that Moses ran into on his way out of Egypt. Okay, they fought, and Moses prevailed, and they were heading south while Moses was heading north, and that's why we believe the Hyksos were actually the Amalekites. Okay, so here we have the synchronizations between all these different timelines. The first occupation of Avaris, the Walling biblical timeline in regards from Joseph to the Exodus, all of the 12th dynasty and 13th dynasty benchmark events, Sennacherib II, Sennacherib III, the rise of the 13th and 14th dynasty, Sebek Hotep and his possible connection to Moses, along with, by the way, Sebek Hotep's daughter, Fendi, who has got some exceptional events in her that relates to Moses as well. So, all right, and then you have the last pharaoh of the 13th dynasty, Menepher A, 23 years, and all of these times coming to an end in about 1550, 1552. There's just too many, and I didn't even name all of them. I just chose a few highlighted benchmark events, but there's dozens and dozens and dozens. For instance, the end of first first occupation of Avaris, they found a statue of Joseph with his coat of many colors. all of the houses showed evidence of being evacuated in a hurry. There was skeletons of babies underneath the houses there, from 1 to 3 years old, I think they said, and the list goes on and on and on. And then not to mention that the papyrus that had the list of Hebrew names on it, especially Shapira. So we can go on and on and on, which we will get to later on in this series here, to get specific about all these things. We even found Joseph under Sennacherib III, the treasurer, the friend of Pharaoh's, the builder of canals, having the signet ring, you name it. So yeah, we found Joseph too. So we'll get into all that. So anyway, here's a good start, um, and it's a good reference as we go along.
I want to do a little correction here. I'd been quoting the time of Joseph in Egypt as 1776. It's actually 1777. I had that in error when I first initially made this, but I replaced this timeline with a corrected one. So that would be from 1777 to 1552, and from 1777 to 1697 when he died. And about, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years later, really, the 13th dynasty arose after the 12th dynasty came to an end.
All right, so now we have the Woolen biblical timeline. Let's go through this. You have it. I have it separated in 3 segments, from David to Abraham, from Abraham to Shem, and from Shem, or the flood actually, to Adam. So we know that David was inaugurated as the king of Israel in 1010, Saul king of Israel 40 years earlier in 1050, the judges, according to Paul, 450 years earlier in 1500. We determined Joshua's time from the campaign to his death was 12 years, so that was 1550-12 when the campaign started. 40 years earlier, 40 years in the desert, brings us back to the Exodus in 1552. We have where they came into Egypt 215 years earlier in 1767. We know Jacob was 130 years old when he came into Egypt, so he was born in 1897. And then Isaac was 60 years old when he had Jacob, and he was born, if you add 60 to that, to 1957, and Abraham was born 100 years earlier in 2057. Okay. And then from Abraham to Shem, we have here their times, which goes from 2057 to 247 when you do all their times, ages of when they were born. And this time also includes the time of Babel and about 2172. Peleg's age was probably around 76, being the matriarch of his clan at the time. And then you also have Eber here, who scholars believe the Hebrews were named after Hebrew, and then all the way back to Shem in 2447. And then, of course, we had 100 years later, after Shem was born, was the flood. So starting, the flood would have been in 2347. Again, we said Shem 2447. And then you take the ages, and the chronology of those ages based on the Masoretic text brings you to 403 when Adam was born, and that was also at the time of creation. Okay, so now here we're going to start with the judges of Israel's timeline. And we see that Paul said that it was about 450 years. When you do the actual chronologies given in the Bible, you actually come up with about 450 years. The only guessing game we have here is Samuel. But if we know everything else, All we got to do is subtract that from the 450 years, and we know Samuel's time. So starting here in 1500 after Joshua's time of rest, we have no judge for 8 years, Othniel for 40 years, no judge for 18, Ehud 80 years, Shamgar for probably less than 1 year actually, Deborah for 40, and there was also the King Jabin that was oppressing the Israelites at the same time as Deborah's reign. You also have no judge for 7 years after that, Gideon for 40, Abimelech for 3, Tola for 23, Jair for 22. Then they had no judge for 18 years. Then you have Jephthah for 6 years in 1200 BC. And Judges 11:26 tells us that at the start of his judgmentship, there was 300 years had gone by. So 1200 plus 300 equals 1500. So there is a good check that this is correct. So really, if you take this as gospel, then no matter what happened in between, no matter what the argument is, it's still 300 years. I found that Deborah, there is a 320 years if you include the Hazor's king Jabin here that oppressed the children of Israel. However, if you, with all the clues that we have, and we're going to get into that, you realize that King Jabin's time was coincident with Deborah's time. It brings us to 300 years. So you have two witnesses. You have Jephthah, which comes right and says 300 years. Then you have the actual timing that is equal to 300 years. So that is pretty much confirmed. Then after that, you have Ibzan for 7, Elon for 10, Abdon for 8, the Philistines that ruled over for 40, which time Samson was under the whole time of the Philistines, so his coincided with the Philistines. After which Eli arose for the judge of Israel. Then you had Samuel. The Bible really doesn't tell of his time, but it gives us plenty of clues to determine that time. And then you had, brings us to Saul, who was the first king of Israel for 40 years, and then to David, who was inaugurated in 1010. We're pretty confident about that, for 40 years. So if you start at 1010 and you do all the math back, you come up to the Judges in 1500. All right, so Judges 11:26 confirms that from the settlement of Palestine, and that's a key word, the settlement of Palestine, and that comes from Paul, and Jephthah. That is actually the time of the Judges, the beginning of the Judges, where some people like to say, oh, that's uh, from the start of Joshua, which is not a settlement. Joshua was campaigning to take Palestine, and it certainly wasn't settled at that time. And some people even tried to justify the First Kings 6:1 by taking it back to the Exodus, which is absurd. So here we go. So Judges 11:26 confirms that from the settlement of Palestine to the start of Jephthah's term was exactly 300 years. And we just looked at that. 300 plus 1200 is 1500, confirming the accuracy of the judge's chronology. See figure 3:1 here. So we have two witnesses. We have his actual time that he gave us, and then when you do the accounting, you come to 1500. Okay. Jabin's time of oppression, 20 years, we talked about that, was under Deborah's term as judge, as the scripture denotes in Judges 4:3. She judged Israel at that time, at that time, at that time. That time reference is the period of King Jabin's oppression of the children of Israel. Deborah's song relays that in the days of her predecessor, the oppression started, which would be Shamgar, until she arose from her 20-year slumber. Until she arose. The song relayed in Judges 5:12 urges Deborah to awake, 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 awake. She was sleeping. Why would they tell her? Why would they sing and tell her to awake unless she was sleeping during this time of oppression due to her lack of action for the period of oppression? So here we go. Another bit of evidence supporting the theory that Deborah's first 20 years judging Israel coincided with Jabin's time of tyranny are the dates of Deborah's time starting in 1353, okay, and the second destruction layer of Hazor in 1334 BC. So the secular archaeological findings of Hazor found actually three destruction layers. One at about 1550, the same time as Jericho. Then one in 1334. Now, understand that these times I'm referring to are all in biblical timeline, whereas the secular times are based on, well, the first one is based on Egypt or archaeological dating. The second two are based on carbon 14 dating. And so they came up with a carbon 14 date that I adjusted according to my B&H theory and came up with 1334 BC, which is actually 19 years later. So from 1353 BC, when Deborah became judge, to the destruction of Hazor, the second layer, was 1334, which is 19 years later. So we have three indicators, witnesses, as follows. Judges 4:3, she judged Israel at that time, the period of Jabin's tyranny, which we discussed in the previous frame. And also we discussed Judges 5:12 urges Deborah to awake, 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 awake for not acting for 20 years. And now we have, based on the scientific evidence, that Deborah's time started in 1353 to the destruction of Hazor 1334 is 19 years. So we have three sources. Let all things be established between two or three witnesses. We have three witnesses here that definitely identify that Jabin's time of tyranny was coinciding with Deborah's term of judge. Okay. Okay, the next sequence of events. Remember, we're going backwards in time. So we had the Judges period. Right before the Judges period, we had the Joshua campaigns. So here we have the ruins of Joshua's campaigns. The first area of interest is Jericho. This bit of evidence is outstanding. The ruins of Jericho, the first city that Joshua defeated entering the Promised Land, echo the biblical account very accurately with the destruction of the walls and the burning of the city in about 1500 BC. One unique fact that stays congruent with the biblical account are the walls of the city. The walls of Jericho were rubble about the entire city except one portion of the wall believed to have been the abode of Rahab, who is in the genealogy of Christ and who helped the Israelites, as her home was on the wall. According to the biblical account, the two spies escaped through her window and were lowered down outside the city walls. She was protected by God and the people of God during the siege. Okay, so all the walls came down except her house. Okay, and that's what we found. We found all the walls, just decimated, crumbled all the way around the city except one portion where there was actually a house there. Additionally, the ruins were under a layer of ash, as expected, with Joshua burning the city to the ground. Okay, so it just fits the biblical narrative to the T. The Wallen biblical timeline for the fall of Jericho is 1512 BC. The magnetosphere inflated C14 dates equates to 1595 BC based on table I1 that we concluded back in the introduction and also Appendix B. The average carbon-14 dating from 1993 AD to 2000 AD based on the highest density modeling is at 1596 BC. See figure 3.3. Kathleen Kenyon places the Jericho conflagration, that's the burn layer, strata, at 1550 BC based on typology datum lines. All dating sources are within acceptable margins of error, confirming the 1512 BC date as the most auspicious. So here we have Jericho. We have evidence that reflect exactly what is said in the Bible. My goodness, how could somebody from the 3rd century BC have made this up? Like so many proponents for the secular community want to say, there's too much, uh, you know, micro details to have been made up. I mean, right here alone, there's nothing in the rubble saying, oh, this was Jericho. Oh, this this is how it happened. No, this was recorded at the time that it happened by Joshua. Okay, now let's talk about Hazor. There are 3 destruction layers are associated with Hazor, 2 of which precisely coincide with the biblical narrative. Hazor was destroyed by fire in 1550 BC, which is exactly the same time as Jericho based on archaeology dating methods. This event was about 40 years after the Exodus in 1512 BC in accordance with the Wallen biblical timeline. The dates are well within an acceptable margin of error, about 38 years difference between the archaeological dating methods and the Wallen biblical timeline. I mean, you're talking, what, 3,550 years ago. So that's pretty good margin of error. Hazor was destroyed by fire again in about 1334 BC, according to the Wallen biblical timeline, 1400 BC secular date, which is about the time of Deborah. Her time was from 1353 to 1313 BC, when adjusted to align with the Wallen biblical timeline based on carbon-14 date testing of the wheat at this period. Deborah caused Jabin's death in about 1334 to 1343 BC, and apparently either she or the Pharaoh of Egypt, Thutmose IV, raised Hazor by fire at this time. The raising of Hazor was not mentioned in the Bible as an action of Israel at the time of Deborah. The Pharaoh at this time was Thutmose IV, and his date from the Wallen biblical timeline was 1341 to 1332 BC, who made an armed tour of Syria, Palestine, during which he quelled some minor uprisings, and may have been the source of the destruction of Hazor in conjunction with Megiddo, as these events were included in the Song of Deborah. Very interesting. So we have Hazor, we have Jericho, and actually Ai as well. They believe that all were destroyed at about the same time, 1550 BC. They don't. A lot of the secular archaeologists say that this was not the time of the Exodus because they want to place the time of the Exodus based on the Genesis in 1250 BC, and then others have a conflict with the First Kings 6:1 being in 1450 BC, but all this very much aligns with the 1550 BC dates in accordance with the Acts timeline. Okay, now let's look at something here about their time in Egypt, Israel's time in Egypt. There's a conflict here that we need to address. So, determining the time of the children of Israel in Egypt. There are several biblical verses that give conflicting lengths of time from when Jacob and the children of Israel went into Egypt to when the Exodus occurred. Following the principles of God's word that says to let every word be established by two or three witnesses. There's Matthew, Corinthians, First Timothy, Hebrews. This author has concluded that there is a copy in error that must be addressed first. Remember the exegesis guidelines, the Bible interprets the Bible. So we're going there, and this is one of the guidelines. This is one of the safeguards God put in His Word so we can always establish doctrine based on two or three witnesses here. So let's start taking a look at this. So in Exodus 12:40, the verse reads, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years." This is given in the King James Bible, derived from the Hebrew Masoretic text. Okay, but Septuagint and the Samaritan Old Testament text infer that instead it should read, "From the time Abraham came into Canaan to the Exodus was 430 years." All right, so let's look at witness one, the Exodus 12:40 from the Septuagint. The Septuagint scripture reads, "And the sojourning of the children of Israel, while they sojourned in the land of Mizraim," that's Egypt, "and the land of Canaan, was 430 years." So it included both their time in Egypt and in Canaan. Okay, so it was in Egypt and in Canaan. It was 430 years. That's the way it reads in the Septuagint. All right, and then in the Samaritan scriptures, our second witness reads, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel and of their fathers in the land of Canaan and in the land of Egypt," again including Canaan and Egypt, "was 430 years." Okay, so we got two different translations of the Bible that do agree that the 430 years was from the time that Abraham came into Canaan to the time of the Exodus. Okay, and now Paul here very adamantly confirms these scriptures. So, and this is in all the Septuagint, the Samaritan, and the well, not the Samaritan, that's or the Septuagint. Those are actually Old Testament, but in the King James version, it reads from Galatians 3:16. "Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not, and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ." And in Galatians 3:17, "And this I say, that the covenant that was confirmed before of God in Christ, the law, which was 430 years after the covenant, 430 years." Let me read that again. "And this I say, that the covenant that was confirmed before of God in Christ, the law, which is 430 years after the covenant, cannot disannul." So the law could not disannul the covenant made 430 years after. When was the covenant made? "That it should make the promise of none effect." So the promise, that is the covenant that we're talking about here, was made by God with Abraham the year he came into Canaan at 75 years old, Genesis 12:1 through 5, and confirmed when he was 99 years old, 17 through 1:9. So the covenant was when it was first given to Abraham when he came in, okay, to Canaan. And then it was confirmed again a little bit after that, when he was 99. And so that 430 years referenced by Paul was from the covenant to the law. We know the law was given the first year they came out of Egypt in the Exodus. So right there it is. It's pretty solid at this point. That's our third witness. And then witness number 4 is Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews. Puts it this way: "They left Egypt in the month of Exanthians on the 15th day of the lunar month, 430 years after our forefather Abraham came into Canaan, but 215 years only after Jacob removed into Egypt." So he's very specific: 430 years from Abraham's coming into Canaan just like Paul says, just like the Septuagint says, just like the Samaritan Bible says, and he specifically states, but 215 years in Egypt. Okay, so that's our fourth witness. And then our fifth witness. All right, so we had three biblical references, one historian reference, and now a scientific reference from archaeology. So our fifth witness is another significant bit of corroborating evidence is the dates held by Manfred Vitek for the start and end of the first Semitic occupation of Avaris. Okay, and he has that dated from 1783 to 1550 BC, which are perfectly matched with this biblical timeline from 1777 to 1552 BC. All right, that's 233 years. This is 200 well, that's actually, yeah, that's 215 years. And actually, when you count Joseph's time from 1767, it's another 10 years. That's 225 years of the occupation of Avaris. So that's very close. Vitek confirms that it was the Hebrews that occupied Avaris at this time. So we have five very solid witnesses. So it is well established by five witnesses versus the one that the 430 years referenced in Exodus 12:40 should be better be accepted as Abraham's coming into Canaan at 75 years old, 430 years to the Exodus. Okay, so now the preceding benchmark event, the coup de grace, the center of all argument here is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Okay, so this, of course, 40 years prior to the Joshua campaigns, and according to the alignments that we came up when we adjusted the dynasties of Egypt to match up to the Wallen biblical timeline based on our scientific analysis. Um, we got we found the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So the description of the end of Pharaoh Menepher A's dynasty in 1661, which actually coincided with the exact carbon-14 dating of the end of Avaris, or as we talked about, the end of Avaris, Menepher Vitek came up with 1550 based on your archaeological methodologies, your datum lines, and then when we did the adjusting to the dynasties, we found Menepher A's dynasty actually came to an end at the exact same date, 1661. So, and as we previously showed, that the dynasties of Israel these days are pretty much marked by carbon-14 dating. So the carbon-14 date of the end of the 13th dynasty, which coincided with the end of Menepher A's dynasty, was 1661 BC, and the carbon-14 date of the end of Avaris was 1661 BC. So we had a beautiful matchup there. And then, of course, the proof of concept is when we looked into Menepher A's dynasty, what did we find? So we find the description of the end of Pharaoh Menepher A's dynasty in 1552, while in biblical timeline, appears to reflect the state of affairs in Egypt at this time congruent with the biblical record, the Exodus. Menepher A's reign from 1576 to 1552, 23 years, according to the Wallen biblical timeline, was marked by a relatively small number of artifacts attributed to him. This may be indicative of problems in Egypt in his time, since evidence shows that by the end of his reign, the administration of the Egyptian state seems to have completely collapsed. Well, when you have the death angel come and put to death all of the firstborn of Egypt, which, by the way, are the administration of Egypt. See, when you get appointed to an administrative office in Egypt in the time, you are succeeded by your firstborn son. And it goes down the line like that. So if you destroy the firstborn son, you destroy the administration of Egypt. It appears that the capital of Egypt, Itwa, was abandoned at the end of A's reign. Okay, that was the area there near the where the uh, uh, a virus was located there in the Delta, was abandoned at the end of A's reign. Some scholars considered Murnefer A to be the last pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt due to this collapse. That was a major event. I know David Rowe has a quote from some pharaoh about around with a secular date of around 1450, totally ignoring the fact that those secular dates are based on carbon 14 dating, and carbon 14 dating about this time is about 100 years off. So first off, he's got the wrong pharaoh, and there was just a small quote from the pharaoh or from one of the priests, I think at the time, saying, "Oh, God punished us for we don't know why at this time." Well, that's just that could be in reference to anything, but it's certainly not a collapse of a dynasty, which is major. This is major. The end of it, not only the end of a dynasty, but the end of an era, the end of the 13th dynasty. Okay, and the end of the Middle Kingdom. Major, major, major uh, 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 evidence here. Okay, so A's time included the loss of Egyptian provinces in Canaan to the invading Amorites under the direction of Hittite king Hattusili from the start of his reign, 1576 BC. So God, that was the start of Manasseh A's reign. God visited the sins of the fathers of the 13th dynasty to the fourth generation, landing on A for enslaving the Hebrews. Okay. A lost all the lands, the administration of Egypt, his army, his riches, his heir, and his life, which was everything Egyptian gained under Joseph. So there's just an incredible reflection of the biblical narrative here. There is just no doubt in my mind, anyway, because of all the evidence, because of all the coinciding um, benchmark events that happen at this time, like we previously reviewed, that Manasseh A was the pharaoh of the Exodus. Okay, so there's a lot of Egyptologists, a lot of biblical scholars, and historians that want to attribute the pharaoh of the Exodus to the secular dating, like we talked before, the First Kings 6:1 at around 1450. But for the most part, those pharaohs lived on after the Exodus. But the Bible is very clear. I don't care how you want to word it, and you've got to be careful. You do not want to twist the word of God. The Bible, with two or three witnesses, the Bible says, let every word be established by two or three witnesses, is very clear that the Pharaoh died at this time, along with his army, along with the end of the dynasty. So Exodus 14:27 states, "And Moses stretched forth his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to his strength when the morning appeared. And the Egyptians fled against it, and the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea." We're talking about Pharaoh and his army. Psalms 106:10 through 11. "And he saved them from the hand of him," singular, a specific person, a pronoun. "And he saved them from the hand of him that hated them, and redeemed them from the hand of the enemy. And the waters covered their enemies, and there was not one of them left." The Bible is very clear that Pharaoh was leading this army. There was not one of the enemy. Definitely, the Pharaoh was the number one enemy. He was leading the army. he was the one that was mad at them for overcoming Egypt. Psalms 136:15. But overthrew Pharaoh and his host in the Red Sea. I don't know how you could say it any plainer than that. For his mercy endureth forever. And the number one proponent for this claim that it was Amenhotep the second, okay, which was from 1428 to 1370 BC. All right, so Douglas Petrovic claims that Amenhotep II was the pharaoh of the Exodus, and makes a very far-reaching excuses for why he didn't die at the time of the Exodus, which was in 1448 BC, which his secular time is actually a little bit late, which is okay. I'm okay with that in that margin of errors, but not the fact that he lived over 20 years later. So, so he makes these far-reaching excuses for why he didn't die at the time of the Exodus, having reigned for more than 20 years after this marked event. No, sorry, you have uh, the actual event in Exodus. You have Psalms 106, 136. All three of these, let every word be established by two or three witnesses, make it very clear that he died during the Exodus. This Pharaoh died during the Exodus. His reign came to an end during the Exodus. Okay, so I love Douglas Petrovich, but he is mistaken in this instance. There's so much more work that he has done that he should get kudos for. Like I said, I love this man, but he's wrong in this instant. I'm sorry. They just don't consider that these reigns of these pharaohs are based on carbon 14 dating. Carbon 14 dating, which they hate, which most every Bible scholar and even archaeologist just rejects. But yet, when they go to try to align the Egyptian chronologies with the biblical timeline, they go by these dates. There's a disconnect there, so they need to come up to par with creation science, really, and then we can proceed from there.
Okay, now let's talk about the Ippur papyrus. The Ippur papyrus is an ancient Egyptian hieratic papyrus. It's up in the form of a poem, with the most extant copy dated to the 19th dynasty of Egypt. The papyrus contains descriptions of catastrophic events in Egypt that are in many ways similar to the plagues described in Exodus 7 to 12. The events described and the era of the writing has been dated to the 13th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom and no earlier than the 12th dynasty, which is within the time period of the Exodus at the end of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. That's qualified for that. So this is interesting. Wait till we see how close the descriptions are. 9 of the 10 plagues.
Okay, so here we have the recordings of this Egyptian priest around the end of the 13th dynasty, okay, with this poem. And he lists several uh, events that happened here at one time. And then we're going to compare them to the Exodus events that definitely happened at the time of the Exodus. All right, so this is the Ippur Papyrus plagues compared to the 10 plagues of Egypt. The first we have here is the river is blood. Okay, now these are just taking excerpts from the poem. And then over here we have in the Exodus, all the waters of the river were turned to blood. Then we have the men thirst after water. And in the Exodus, the Egyptians dug around the river for water to drink. Okay, the gates, columns, and walls are consumed by fire. And then in the Exodus, and fire came down to the earth. Ippur, everywhere barley has perished. Exodus, and the flax and the barley were smitten. The cattle moan because of the state of the land. The hand of the Lord is on the cattle which is in the field. Men are few, and he who places his brother in the land, he who bears his brother, is everywhere. The children of princesses are dashed against walls. At midnight the Lord smote all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the captive who was in prison. The pestilence is throughout the land, and I have sent forth my hand and smitten you and your people with pestilence. The land was not lit. There was a thick darkness, or a darkness of gloom in all the land of Egypt. Gold, lapis lazuli, silver are strung about the necks of maidservants, and they asked of the Egyptians articles of silver and gold, and they plundered Egypt. Well, that's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different events that were exactly, exactly as written in the Bible. Okay, so you got two different sources, the biblical narrative and this Egyptian priest's poem, that are practically identical in these events. I don't know. This is really in your face. It all was written at the same time, and it was all identical in sequence. My goodness, my goodness. You can't beat this, I'm telling you. Okay, now let's take a look at the overwhelming supporting evidence of the Exodus here. Well, the occupation of Avaris and who it was. Okay, all right, let's start with number one here. The archaeological excavation site at Avaris revealed a community laid out on a virgin soil. In other words, there was nothing else. When you go down into the strata, there was nothing else built in this area. This is the first time anything was built in this area. On virgin soil in the area that was formerly known in antiquity as Goshen. Okay. Based on typology dating methods, that's your archaeological dating methods, according to archaeologist Manfred B. Tech, the site was first occupied from 1783 to 1550 BC, about 233 years. When you think about when Joseph was first made second ruler in Egypt, it was 10 years before Israel came in. We know Israel was there for 215 years, according to Scripture. So that would have put Joseph as 225 years, very close in time there. Okay. This community contained a high official's estate sporting a mansion with 12 pillars and about 70 to 100 other houses similar in build as those in Haran in Mesopotamia, where Abraham was originally from. In the back of the mansion was found 12 tombs, 11 of which had skeletons laid out on their side as a Palestinian would be buried, as opposed to an Egyptian who would have been buried on his back facing up. And of course, there's very significance of the way they place their hands and arms, whether they're by their side, whether there's one across their heart, or whether there's two hands crossed and all that. So basically, we concluded that these were not Egyptian graves. Okay, the 12th tomb was in a style that is normally reserved for Egyptian royalty, except that this person was not Egyptian, suggesting that he was regarded with the highest esteem by the pharaoh. This particular tomb was empty. However, it was found with a great statue of the person of whom the tomb was built. He is described as a Palestinian due to his hairstyle and throw stick across his shoulder. Additionally, he was wearing a coat of many colors. Okay, so this is very interesting, isn't it? Okay. Okay, so this is a recreation of the statue that was there. What they found in the archaeological dig site was actually just a bunch of pieces. The head there, the throw stick. So it was all crumbled. Somebody had come in and destroyed this statue, but there was enough remains here to piece it back together to give a good description of what this looked like, and the colors in this coat of many colors could still be seen to a certain degree. So it was pretty interesting to see the remains, and then this diagram that came from the David Roll. Well, actually, I think this was from actually Timothy Mahoney and the Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus. He gave me permission to reprint this here. So yeah, Patterns of Evidence. So isn't this interesting? Look at this. We're looking at Joseph here. We're looking at this Joseph, this handsome man at this time, of course. Of course, this would he died at 110 years old. I'm pretty sure this was in his what he looked like in his prime or something. But isn't that interesting? There's the throw stick. Okay. Here's the hairstyle and all that. It doesn't look Egyptian at all. This does not look Egyptian at all, other than maybe this right here. So, there's just no argument that this guy was definitely not Egyptian. If you look at any of the iconography of Egyptian uh, statues and all that, this is nowhere near Egyptian. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at some of the other supporting evidence from a virus. A lot of this information came from David Roll's book, David Roll's Resources, and Timothy Honey's documentary. So let's take a look at what we got here. So we have number one, further patterns of evidence discovered at the site of Avaris that parallel the biblical account of the children of Israel in Goshen, especially the slaughter of the babies at the time of the birth of Moses, include, okay, here we go, A, the period of residence in Egypt from 1700s to the 1500s BC based on typology datum lines. Okay. The plague pits, where hundreds of bodies were thrown one on top of the other. Okay, because you had so many of the firstborn die in Egypt, from the pharaohs, from the Egyptians to the slaves. Okay. Then you have Kahun, homes of the Egyptian slaves, where wooden boxes were found under the floors of many of the houses containing the skeletons of sometimes several babies only months old. Okay, that's during the time of where they tried to kill Moses, of course, and they killed the babies, I think, up to 2 years old or something like that. Homes abandoned quickly, apparently as tools and other belongings dropped on the floor and left behind. There's a lot of conditional probability to this point is like tremendously in favor of this model. Okay, the 1550 Exodus and all the evidence and all of the virus and of the Egyptian uh, pharaohs and their dynasties and their reigns. It's just right now conditional probability is just overwhelming. Okay, you got to go by the science. The mortality rate of the children, the 3-to-2 ratio of women to men at the time. Okay, which was found actually, which you can look at the Brooklyn Papyrus and find this ratio here of the women to men, because they killed all of the male children here. Okay, at the time these were male children. Now they have this thing called the Brooklyn Papyrus, okay, which is a list of names of slaves, mostly names of Hebrews or women, of which one of the midwives instructed to kill the Hebrew newborn males is named Shaphrah. Also, the tribes of Issachar and Asher are mentioned. So there's no doubt that the Brooklyn Papyrus is a list of um, Hebrews. Okay, so at this time, this was it. This was found in Avaris during the first occupation of Avaris from 1700s to 1500s. So there's the remains of sheep and goats that are not Egyptian culture, but certainly Palestinian culture. Then you have pottery and tools, especially brass tools from the region of Palestine. Then you have this canal of Joseph, dating to the time period of the occupation of the Semites in Goshen, Avaris, and is still in use today. But they can date this canal all the way back, and it's called the Canal of Joseph in, of course, Egyptian, whatever that language is today. And it's dated. They can track the date all the way back to the end of the 13th dynasty. Isn't that amazing? Actually, to the end of the 12th dynasty. I'm sorry, or the middle of the 12th dynasty. So it's pretty amazing stuff. Okay, here is a map of Egypt here. Um, and also Israel. So here's what we call the Fayum district. You can see here is the Nile River coming through here, and then it fans out here and goes into the Mediterranean. You have Memphis here, and right about in here is Goshen, or a virus, what they call a virus. Okay, so this is where all this happened. The Fayum is where the Pharaoh lived. You see, it's not far from a virus. Some of the other major places. Here's Amarna. Okay, and that's actually a singular place. We'll get into that in some of the later chapters here. Amarna. Here's Thebes along the Nile. You notice these are all along the Nile. Here's Memphis. Let's see what else we have here. Nubia. Here's Nubia. I think this. Here's the second. Here's the first cataract, and a cataract is where the Nile gets very shallow, and you get some white water there, or maybe there is a falls there. That's what a cataract is, where it gets. It's kind of impassable for ships. So you got the cataract, the first cataract, the second cataract. Here's your third cataract, fourth cataract, fifth cataract, and sixth cataract. There's Puntana, Sudan. There's Sudan. Again, there's Nubia. So anyway, there's Libya. Here's Kadesh. We'll talk about that later. There's Mitanni, Anatolia, Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, the Red Sea. And notice this is part of the Red Sea as well. And this is the Red Sea. So they lived here. The Hebrews lived here. They're tracked 3 days into the desert, according to Timothy Timothy. Oh gosh, I forgot his name. Anyway, Timothy Mahoney. He believes they tracked actually through here and crossed the Red Sea here, because God did tell them not to go here due to some threat that they didn't want to get into at that time. So he has a very convincing documentary on that. You should look into that. Okay, here's another closer look at the Delta area. So here's the Nile, comes in here and fans out. It's what they call a delta. And here's the Red Sea. Oh, shoot. So here's the Nile, fans out into the delta and then comes into the Red Sea. Here's Tanis. Here is Pyramses, which is Avaris, which is also a Goshen right there. Okay. You have Memphis right here. Okay. And Itawa, we talked about that. That's this whole area here is the Fayum district. That's what we call the Fayum district. All this right through here, actually. So that's why it's the heavier text here, because all this is the. And then here's Buto. You know, you had Herodotus talking about the flying fiery serpents, which were pterosaurs. He said there was like a multiple, a mass of skeletons from flying fiery serpents right here in Buto. Okay, so that's an interesting thing that I think we reviewed by this time. So this is the Al List Fayum district, is what it's called. Okay. Okay, now let's look at another interesting historical find that came up. This didn't make my book, but I found it a little bit later and had to include it here because this is just outstanding. So, an additional confirmation is found in Mernefer A's successor, Merhotep Ini. That would be Mernefer's son, and obviously not his firstborn son, because we know from the Bible that his firstborn died. So this was one of his other sons there, where he had to appoint a new vizier, because the vizier to his father being Mernefer A Junior, that's the vizier's name, firstborn son of the previous vizier, died of unknown causes. So A Junior was Mernefer A's visor, and he was the firstborn of the previous visor, and he died of unknown causes. Fits the biblical narrative to the T. All right. So this is what the Egyptologist has to say. He says, Ea Meru, the son by visor Ea. Okay. Well, we know that it was the brother of Ea Jr. Okay. And the king's daughter, Reditenis, was appointed governor of El Kab in year 1 of Merhotep Ini's reign there. Okay, the reason for this appointment was due to the unexpected death of the childless governor of El Kab, Ea Jr., who was Visor A's eldest son and Ea Mira's elder brother. Okay, so when Ea's junior died, they appointed Ea Meru, his younger brother, to take his place. Okay, this is congruent with the exact time and specifically the firstborn that would have been affected by the 10th plague of Moses' campaign to free the Hebrew slaves, wherein all the firstborn of Egypt died. Exodus 11:5. Isn't that interesting? So here it is in the Egyptology, in the record of this visor, this firstborn dying at the time of Menefer A's reign, at the end of Menefer A's reign. So this is something again that helps confirm the biblical narrative and the identifying the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So very interesting. Okay, let's continue from there. Proceed back a little bit further in time to the birth of Moses. So Moses was born in 1632 BC by the Wallen biblical timeline, which corresponds to the carbon-14 inflated date of 1725, and places his birth in about the time of the reign of Pharaoh Sobek Hotep III, who reigned for about 3 to 4 years between 1740 and 1720 BC. That again is the secular date uh, that we're trying to relate to here. So Sobek Hotep is believed to have been the author of the Brooklyn Papyrus that we talked about previously, that contains a list of slaves that were to be sold to an estate in Thebes. One of the names listed was Shaphyra. This Shaphyra may have been the midwife instructed to kill the Hebrew newborn males, as she was personally known by the Pharaoh. Exodus 1:15. So there we have a connection. Here we have a connection about this time for Moses, okay? Especially the name of Sapphira tying it together. This Pharaoh appears to be the one that ordered the deaths of the Hebrew newborn males to end Moses' life. Okay, so now you have then you have Moses' Egyptian mother. Okay, it was recorded in the Bible that Pharaoh's daughter took up Moses and raised him as her son. Exodus 2:10. To be able to raise a Hebrew slave as a prince of Egypt, this daughter would have had to have an exceptional station provided by her father, the Pharaoh. Here again we find a special instance where Sobek Hotep's daughter, Ihutibu Fendi, was only one of 2 daughters in all of Egyptian history to have her name shown in a cartouche. Okay, that is where, which is normally reserved for pharaohs. Okay, that is where the name of a pharaoh actually appears in the writing in the script within a oval or shaped kind of surrounding. Okay, so which is normally reserved for pharaohs prior to the end of the Middle Kingdom. After the Middle Kingdom, then just about anybody's who was royalty kind of showed up in the cartouche. But before that, only ones that would be showing up in a cartouche is the Pharaoh himself, but then we find that she was one of 2 daughters in all of Egypt up to that time her name to be shown in a cartouche. Josephus relays that the pharaohs of Moses' upbringing were inclined to have him take the throne to circumvent him leading the Hebrews in a rebellion. I mean, there's a reference of the book 2, chapter 9, 7. So, having his Egyptian mother in the station of co-regent queen would position Moses in an acceptable standing to be received of the Egyptians by the Egyptians. Okay, so there's something going on here. Of all the princes, of all the daughters of pharaohs, this particular one had her name in a cartouche for some reason. Josephus, confirms that the pharaoh's daughter, now he calls her Thermuthis, and then we know her throne name was Ihitubu Fendi, because her name was in a cartouche, was referred to as the queen. So Josephus refers to her as a queen as well. So here we find her name in a cartouche as if she was a queen, maybe a co-regent queen with Pharaoh. And here in a totally separate source, we find her also referenced as a queen, okay, in Book 2, Chapter 9, 5, which is congruent with her historical reference name in a cartouche in Egyptology. So we find that that Fendi, where's that reference here? Let's see. Ihutibu Fendi, also known as Thermuthis, was the daughter of the pharaoh that was trying to kill Moses, just like the Bible says. And so, in order for Moses to be accepted by the Egyptians, she adopted Moses, she raised Moses, and obviously this pharaoh appointed her as a co-regent queen to be more acceptable to the Egyptians. Okay, now the next benchmark event prior to the time of Moses would be Israel's entry into Egypt. So the description of the Pharaoh Senuseret III from 1878 to 1839, the secular date, adjusted for the Wallen Biblical Timeline, would be 1763 to 1726. So Senuseret III's dynasty at the time of the children of Israel entered into Egypt 1767, as when that event happened, appears to reflect the state of affairs in Egypt congruent with the biblical record. Genesis 41. Joseph was about 40 years old when Israel came into Egypt. Okay, this is from the Egyptologists' reviews of Senuseret III. Fundamental changes were made during the reign of Senuseret III in material culture and in the administration. There was also a major overhaul of burial customs, such as the end of the custom of writing extensive rituals and other funerary literature on coffins. Okay, you got to realize that at this time Joseph was the man; he was in charge. The pharaoh. Senuseret III pretty much gave Joseph free hand to do any and everything he wanted to, and of course he was probably not in favor of idolatry. So I'm sure that that's what came about here. The country became more centralized. The provincial centers declined in importance, and the fameless region around the residence of the king grew in scale and wealth. All right. So this is what the Egyptologists have found out about this king, Senuseret III, and that perfectly reflects the narrative of the Bible. Genesis 47:14, and Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the corn which they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. Okay, So yeah, he pretty much absorbed all the money and the riches and all this from the outlands of Egypt and Canaan. Genesis 47:15. And when money failed in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came unto Joseph and said, Give us bread, for why should we die in thy presence? For the money faileth. All right. So that's we see that what happened in Egypt during this Pharaoh's reign perfectly reflects what the Bible describes. So there we have our proof of concept. There we have a perfect alignment and proof of concept. Okay, now let's look at a key figure under Sennacherib III, um, and that would be the treasurer, because we know if the Bible's true, Sennacherib II made Joseph treasurer, and that continued under Sennacherib III. And in researching Sennacherib II and Sennacherib III, the only treasurer that we could find came up under Sennacherib III. And since if this alignment is true, this has to be Joseph. So let's look at this. Joseph was elevated to treasurer under Sennacherib II and continued his office under Sennacherib III. Okay. And the earliest top official under Sennacherib III has been identified as Senanca. Okay. And this is from a rock inscription carved on the island of Sahel, which is kind of singular. There's not a whole lot on Senanca. Okay. But what we did find perfectly fits the narrative of the Bible, perfectly fits the accolades of Joseph. So let's look at Senanca. Can easily be identified in history, as his accolades perfectly match those of Joseph's position and acts under this pharaoh. Senanca bore the titles of royal sealer, sole friend, and leader of works in all of the land. So this is just more. This is more than a treasurer. Okay, this is a close friend, royal sealer, leaders of the works in all of the land. Very specific titles. His main title was treasurer, which is what Joseph was in the Bible. He was also credited for work on a canal with the name of Beautiful Are the Ways of Kakura. Kakura was the throne name of Sennacherib III. So not only did he have all these specific accolades, he having been a royal sealer, which sealing is done with a signet ring, sole friend. Of course, you'd have to be a very good friend of the pharaohs to be his treasurer, to be trusted with all the money and all the works in the whole land. So anything that went on in the land of Egypt and Canaan, um, Joseph was the project manager, was the leader of all this. And his main title, of course, treasurer. That's exactly who Joseph was, and under Pharaoh. And he was also credited for work on a canal. So that's a key. Not only does he have all these accolades that were identified in the Bible, but also the work on the canal, which we talked about earlier, would have been his first project to start building canals in the Fayum district there in the Delta, and in order to raise corn crops for the coming drought. So let's also look at the biblical verses of this time. And the Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt, works in the whole land, over all the land of Egypt. The Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. Took the ring off his hand, royal sealer. The signet ring is how you sealed things in these days. And the Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. Credited leader of works in all the whole land. The Pharaoh called Joseph's name Saphnath Paneah, and he gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, and Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. So this is so exacting, so many details. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 details here that all show up in Joseph's accolades in Genesis. So that's and it's under Sennacherib III, which is where we identify the two pharaohs that were uh, had had Joseph as their number one. So, and we know that he was the treasurer. So this links them all together. This is no doubt Senenka is Joseph. Okay, so we're going to go a little bit further back in time when Joseph was elevated to treasurer of Egypt. Sennacherib II was the pharaoh at the time. Sennacherib II's reign from 1781 to 1766, while in biblical timeline, ushered in a period of peace and prosperity with no recorded military campaigns and the proliferation of trade between Egypt and the Near East. Okay, the Ba Yosef, the waterway of Joseph, is a canal that connects the Nile River with the Fayum in Egypt. This canal was built at about this time. I can track it back in history to about this time, and indeed, Senusret II is famous for work on extensive irrigation systems in the Delta, where Joseph took up residence. The purpose of this project was to increase the amount of cultivable land in that area. Joseph was about 30 years old in 1777 BC. All right, so this is some excerpts from some of the Egyptologists' uh, record of the time, and they specifically note that these canals were for growing crops, for irrigation, not for navigation or any other reason, and specifically for growing crops. So that's the very first thing that Joseph would have attended to when he was lifted up by Sennacherib II to be the treasurer of Egypt and his number one guy. Okay, the only one above Joseph was Sennacherib, and he just left it all up to Joseph to take care of. He just trusted him. He considered him a very close friend and one of the wisest men in the land. So Sennacherib, being a bit of a wise guy himself, thought it prudent to make Joseph his number one and to put it all in his hands. It was a good, very good thing to do because Joseph just blessed him and his household and his land. And now let's take a look at this and see what is said in how that is reflected in the Bible. Genesis 4:41-46. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. And in the 7 plenteous years the earth brought forth by handfuls. And he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. The food of the field which was round about every city laid he up in the same. And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much, until he left numbering, for it was without number. And the 7 years of plenteous that was in the land of Egypt was ended. So he was able to grow an overabundance of crops. How do you do that? You increase your cultivable lands, and you do that especially in the Delta where there was so much water available in the Delta. All you had to do is build these canals that you can feed into irrigation systems to raise, 10 times the amount of crops that you would normally. So this is a very good proof of concept right here. This is poignant. This is outstanding. This is just the great start for this timeline here, and the adjusting of the Egyptian chronologies, how well they fit, how in every benchmark event shows up in Egypt. It's just amazing. Okay, here's a really interesting bit of history here. This is a painting, actually, just a snapshot of a portion of a painting within the tomb of um, where's his name here? Nuemhotep the second, who served under Senuseret the Senuseret the second and the third, and Senuseret's father actually. Um, so his tomb just had these paintings in it, and this one here is very interesting. Let's read about this. So around the same time, parties of Western Asiatic foreigners visiting the pharaoh with gifts are recorded, as in the tomb paintings of the 12th dynasty official Nuemhotep, who also served under Senuseret III. These foreigners, possibly Canaanites and Bedouins, are labeled as Amu. Okay, these were not gifts. This was a quote from one of the Egyptologists, and yeah, he referred to them as gifts, but these were not gifts. Okay, but rather payment for corn due to the drought, as described in Genesis 4:7. At the head of the line is an Egyptian official recording the trades, and you can see him here, and you can see the difference between the Egyptians and their garb and the Asiatics in their garb. Okay, and here is a record that he's holding in his hand, and a little papyrus he's holding his hand down here. So all the tomb paintings displayed prosperous times benefiting the Egyptians with dancing, musical instruments, hunting and fishing, scenes of irrigating fields, collecting figs, wrestling, and such. All right, so they were definitely, according to the, the Egyptologist and the Bible, this was a very prosperous times for the Egyptians, mainly because of the drought and them having the corn uh, that the rest of the country needed. So they were willing to come and give up everything just so they could live. Okay, so let's take a look at this and see how the Bible describes this time, and how perfectly matched up this is. Again, coming under Senuseret the second and the third, according to our um, synchronization. And when the money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us bread, for why should we die in thy presence? For the money faileth." And Joseph said, "Give your cattle, and I will give you for your cattle, if money fail." And they brought their cattle unto Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for horses, for their flocks, all their livestock, and for the cattle of the herds, and for the asses, and he fed them with bread for all their cattle for that year. Genesis 42. And the sons of Israel came to buy corn amongst those that came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. And Joseph was the governor over the land, and he it was that sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brother came and bowed down to themselves before him with their faces to the earth. And that, of course, is reminiscent of the dream that Joseph had as a young man, still living with Israel, Jacob and his brothers, telling them he had dreams where both Israel and all his brothers would bow down to him. Well, God is the God of dreams. So this is very interesting, isn't it? I'm telling you, every time you look into the times and what the events of these time periods as they aligned up in our analysis, it just keeps coming. The evidence just keeps coming. So really cool uh, find here. I'm just looking forward to more discoveries. All right, so we're gonna conclude this session, chapter 3 here, um, with this conclusion. So here we see the accuracy of the Walling biblical timeline post 1800 BC is prodigiously confirmed with the pattern of historical events and carbon-14 dating adjusted in accordance with the B&H theory, our table I1 in the introduction. The period of the judges calculated to close to 450 years, confirming Paul's estimate of about 450 years. The exodus of the Israelites from Egypt in 1552 BC is corroborated by Paul, Josephus, Manetho, and the Matthew 1 through 17 generational constant. So we have this date established by 2 or 3 witnesses in accordance with the exegesis guidelines for interpreting the Bible. So Paul, Josephus, Manetho, Matthew, and many more. We just pointed these, highlighted these because they were the most prominent. So the archaeology, typology dates, and average actual carbon-14 dates matching the estimated inflated carbon-14 dates align perfectly with the fall of Jericho and Hazor conflagration dates at 1512, the Exodus in 1552, and the entry of Israel and Egypt into Egypt in 1777. Okay, perfect alignment here. Just builds on itself here. The dates held by Manfred Vitek for the start and end of the Semitic occupation of Epirus, and that's the first occupation of Epirus from 1783 to 1550, are perfectly matched the biblical timeline of 1777 to 1552 BC. So there we're just the more and more you look into this, the more there is backing, the more there is synchronizations without doing any whole bunch of arbitrary rearranges like most everybody else is doing. This is a perfect match right off the line. So you have a validated, at this point, we have a very validated timeline from Acts, the Acts timeline, as opposed to the first Kings and the Exodus timelines. So then you had the start and end dates of the 13th and 14th Egyptian dynasties, as well as the start of the Hyksos invasion, all three in about 1550 BC. So the 13th dynasty was an Egyptian dynasty. The 14th dynasty was appointed, were mayors or leaders appointed by the 13th dynasty, as over the taskmasters in Epirus. Okay, and they all started. So the start and end dates for the 13th, 14th Egyptian dynasties, as well as the start of the Hyksos invasion, all three in about 1550 BC. So as another perfectly aligned with the biblical timeline, it's verified by carbon-14 three-step dating method. All right, and of course the third step includes adjusting the two-step dating method per the table I1 in our introductory there, which comes from an evaluation analysis that we made in Appendix A and B. Okay, so the descriptions of the Pharaoh of the Exodus, Murnifer A, the Pharaoh of Joseph when appointed to the treasure of Egypt, Sennacherib II, the Pharaoh of the entry of Israel into Egypt, Sennacherib III, the identity of Joseph as Seneca, treasurer under Sennacherib III, the identity of the Pharaoh at the birth of Moses and his daughter, Thendi, Moses' Egyptian mother, the Ipuwer papyrus dated to the end of the 13th dynasty, and several dozen more bits of evidence that we had reviewed, all describe the course of events in their time congruent with the records found in the Bible. That's just too coincidental, don't you think? The conditional probability comes into play here. You cannot have that many coinciding benchmark events happen in both, that you can see both in the Bible and in Egyptology, and it not be correct. It's just you have nothing else that compares. No other timeline you get these alignments, historical alignments of the period for the archaeological site of Avaris, the start and the end of the site. And then when you adjusted the using our keys that we talk about, adjusting the pharaohs, the dynasties of Egypt, and then them aligning perfectly with the narrative of the Bible, and everything else we rehearsed here, you just can't deny it. It's self-explanatory. It's self-reasoning. You cannot um, uh, find any fault with this. Really, there is no fault with this. We're using creation science, all that theory that was out there. We applied it, and lo and behold, look what we came up with. This is amazing. So we finally, using these keys that God gave us, we finally solved this mystery of history and the period of Israel in Egypt and all of the coinciding synchronizations and proof of concepts.